Hi, I'm Sharon TewksburyBloom, facilitator with Bloom Facilitation. And the book that I am sharing with you all is The Art of Gathering, How We Meet and Why It Matters by Priya Parker. I have a pretty well-worn copy of this, and I really appreciate the chance to do this with Lancaster leadership because it gave me a chance to revisit it. I had actually left off with just a little bit left to read and was just reminded again how much I love this book and really want to just live by this book. So the book is broken up into 8 chapters. And if nothing else, I have to give Priya Parker credit for the fact that she has the best chapter headings and subheadings throughout her book. I'm going to highlight them as we go along here. And basically, the whole premise of the book is the idea that whether you're gathering people socially for a party, a dinner, or whether you're gathering them for an employee retreat or a strategic planning meeting or some sort of work gathering, or also the work that Priya has done with actually peace negotiations and conflict resolution in really tense situations. All of these gatherings, you thinking about how to gather people together, really being intentional about it, it makes such a huge difference in achieving the outcome you're looking to achieve. And there are some general principles and rules of thumb and ways that you can know more about how to gather people to be better at it. As a professional facilitator, this is my jam. I absolutely love this. But I think if you're coming at it from the leadership hat, then it's important to understand this, particularly in the big picture sense, getting a sense just from reading a book, for example. Even if you're not necessarily going to be responsible for every element of this, understanding what the principles are, why it matters, what the key things to think about are, is going to be really essential as a leader. Okay, so let's dive into it. Not surprisingly, Priya starts with the why. Understanding your purpose and the intention for the gathering is the most essential thing. And if you really are short on time, if you can just read the first chapter of this book, she calls it Why We Are Gathering, then that will already get you so far. She gives some really great examples of how often we think that we know why we're gathering, but really we just know the category. Like we're gathering to do networking. Okay, but why? Why are you networking? What are you hoping to gain by networking? So she really challenges you to go deeper. So 2 pieces of advice that sound maybe counterintuitive that she gives in the first chapter is one is pull back, get the big picture to try to help you understand the big picture purpose of what you're gathering for. And then the other is to drill down to really understand the specifics of what it is that you're trying to achieve. And throughout the book, one thing that's really cool is that Priya gives so many different examples. She's a great storyteller. And in this chapter alone, she's telling you examples from how we bring people together for a court proceeding, for a Hindu wedding, for a newsroom editing meeting. So you'll just love if you decide to actually read it in depth. She gives in so many different settings. So once you understand why you're gathering, that really helps you put form to it. She talks about how sometimes the form starts to dictate the function. So, for example, in a wedding, you may have things about how you ritualize the wedding gathering. So, I know, like in my own wedding, there was a big conversation that we had about our parents or our fathers going to, is my father going to give me away? Or are our parents going to give me away? Or how do we think about that? Because we can understand the original intent behind how that part of the gathering was designed, but is that still lining up with what our intent is now? So in my sense, we decided that my future husband and I would walk into our ceremony together, just like we wanted to walk into this relationship as equals and together. And then we had a special ritual we did with our parents to show that they were sort of blessing the union, giving their support to it, but taking that and finding a new way to ritualize it. This quote that she has at the end of the chapter is great. She says, "Purpose is your bouncer." So really, once you know your purpose, that can help you make those decisions about who not to invite, who not to give the stage to, how to structure it. So really everything, starts from understanding your intention and your purpose. 2 is close doors. Love this, close doors. She uses the phrase, the kindness of exclusion. And I think about this a lot in what I hear from leaders about how they feel like they're in meetings all day long. And I think that's a common issue, especially as you gain a leadership position, is you get invited to more and more meetings. And a lot of times you're not actually needed for the purpose of that meeting. And it is kindness to exclude you from that meeting. And she talks explicitly about that. She also talks about if everyone is invited, then no one is invited. So really, again, being intentional about who you invite to this meeting. Once you understand the purpose of the meeting, then you should know, based on that, who actually needs to be there. And doing that with an actual invitation, making it clear why someone is invited to the meeting or the gathering. She has an interesting part of this chapter where she talks about exclusion and this challenge of diversity and inclusion. And her phrase is that good exclusion activates diversity. Good exclusion activates diversity. And you can probably think about this from your own life of a time, maybe you were in a women's leadership group, maybe you're part of a mastermind or something. By creating an exclusive group of people who had some things in common, you were actually probably able to be more open, more authentic, and to come with the diversity of your story, your lived experience, yourself to that gathering. It was able to bring in other types of diversity because you made it specific and you were exclusive in who you invited to that gathering. There's a cool example in this chapter of something called Judson Manor, which is a retirement community that also has music students from the college who are invited to live there. So they have this interesting dynamic and partnership where the music students have a chance to practice in the retirement community. And so they're very exclusive in terms of only being open to those two groups, but through that, they're able to create some unique opportunities. Then there's the who of who you're inviting and who you're excluding. Then there's also the where. So we've got the why, then the who, then the where. And she was talking in this chapter about how you really want to seek a setting for your gathering that embodies the reason for your convening. That's her phrase. So that's why it does kind of go in that order. Why, who, then where. And once you know those others, then you'll know the where. The book does include some specifics about, for instance, the perimeter, the area, and the density that you should consider for your gathering based on what type of dynamic you're trying to have. Is this a lively cocktail party where you really want a lot of energy and it's going to feel like vibrant? Or is this a small, intimate, cozy gathering? And that's all going to determine how much space you need, how close people are seated together, what you want the room layout to be. All right, now chapter 3, she titles, Don't Be a Chill Host. And I love this quote. Hosts assume that leaving guests alone means that guests will be left alone, when in fact, they will be left to one another. I love this, and I have seen this so many times. You think that you're doing something nice by not being too involved, not being too authoritarian with your authority as a host. And so you're just like, we're just going to come and it's going to be chill. And I'm not going to try to dictate what happens. And just like she says, when you're leaving your guests without structure, without any sort of, connection to each other, without really taking an active role in hosting, then instead of leaving your guests alone and having that be a gift to them, you are leaving them to one another. And that could go any way. It depends who you've got there. And it most certainly probably won't go the way that you desired it to go. This other phrase that I like that she used is called authority is an ongoing commitment. I think, that definitely applies to planning a gathering. I think that also applies to leadership in general. The idea that when you are given authority, or when you accept authority by taking on the role of hosting a gathering, that is an ongoing commitment. If you're just saying, I'm going to host a party and I'm going to leave it at the door and wash my hands of it, everyone's here, but I'm no longer going to take any authority over it, that's really a disservice to your guests. You're the one who invited people to this gathering. You are now in an ongoing commitment through the end of that gathering. 2 pieces of advice she gives for what you do in that role of host is, one is to equalize your guests. This I see a lot in meetings, and this can be a real gift from a leader, or often this is sometimes challenging for the leader of a group to do if it's a meeting that you're in or that you're hosting. Sometimes you need to actually have a moderator or a facilitator who can assist in this way. But by thinking about how you set up the room, by thinking about how you structure your agenda, how you how much you're going to structure conversation or plan activities, those can often be ways where you can equalize your guests. You can give everyone an equal opportunity to speak, for example, or you can have a round table where everyone is equally positioned and no one is in a power position around the table. So equalize your guests. And then 2 is connect your guests. And I think of this a lot from hosting dinner parties or hosting gatherings on a personal level. That classic, hi, Julie. Hi, Emily. Julie has done a triathlon recently. Emily is training to hike Mount Kilimanjaro. Speak. I sometimes do exactly that when I'm hosting, just giving people some interesting tidbit that they might have in common or that they might find interesting, and giving them just enough to go off of, and then letting them continue and moving on to the next person. All right, speaking of moving on, let's move on to the 4th chapter, create a temporary alternative world. Didn't I tell you she has the best chapter headings? Create a temporary alternative world. There's a really interesting deep dive in this chapter about etiquette. And what she titles the subheading is actually Random Knowledge of How Old Rich People Want You to Behave. Love that. I personally grew up in Northern Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C. I completely understood what she meant by that, and then dove in further to read about her own story of going to cotillion. My sister went to cotillion. She fought it so much that she did not have a good experience, and I, therefore, as the younger sister, didn't end up doing cotillion. But certainly, raised where I was taught a lot of etiquette rules, and I remember my mom particularly focused a lot on table manners and how everything needed to be placed at the table, which utensil was used for what. And when I was in high school, I happened to have dressed up on a Monday, just randomly decided to wear a dress to school. And suddenly I had a teacher come over to me and say, "Hey, you look nice today. Would you like to go into Washington, D.C.? We have an open seat because one of the students who was supposed to go is sick." Like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but sure, free food sounds great. I went along, and it turned out it was at an embassy in Washington, D.C., and it was to honor some women's rights activists in Afghanistan. They had a woman from Afghanistan who was speaking, and then there were a lot of women who were either ambassadors or ambassadors' wives. And that's who I was seated with at this very formal lunch party. And it was one of the first, it might be the first time I can ever remember where I was not at home and I felt like my table manners were on display. And I felt very nervous about, oh my gosh, they have all the utensils, they have multiple glasses. What am I supposed to use for what? And then I looked over, and one of the women next to me, I think she was from Bangladesh, and she actually picked something up with her hands and ate it with her hands. And everyone seemed to think that that was perfectly acceptable. And it was like everything that I have been taught suddenly was broken in that moment because there was a different norm in this very diverse luncheon that I was at. And I was relieved and thought it was amazing. But it was also this interesting insight into what Priya talks about in this book about how etiquette rules were really meant in a homogeneous society to teach people the right way of doing things. And it was codes of conduct, and it's who knows them and who doesn't know them, and a way to show up in society to show that you know have earned your place, or you deserve to be there, you understand the way things happen in that space. And to a certain degree that kind of works within certain societies and within certain groups of people where you're trying to create a norm and establish certain patterns of behavior. But as Priya points out, as we move into this more diverse and inclusive world, and we're trying to host gatherings where people are coming from different backgrounds and lived experience, we should be aware of the fact that we can't expect that everybody has that same level of background with certain etiquette rules or certain norms. And what is actually really fun and freeing and a great form of leadership is to create your own norms and rules and be explicit about them for your gathering. She gives examples of this, like the Jeffersonian dinner, the diner en blanc. And I've also seen this done a lot with the liberating structures frameworks, where you are very explicit, very clear with everyone coming in. These are the rules we're going to operate under. Now, I know a lot of people at the beginning of a meeting might set up ground rules together. That's also something you can do, but this book really shows some really fun ways to actually establish and educate everybody on, for this meeting or this gathering, these are the rules we're going to follow. So I just found that to be a really exciting chapter. The next chapter, another great title, Never Start a Funeral with Logistics. I have also seen this happen at formal events, at meetings. The very first thing when the person gets up to welcome everyone, instead of starting with a dynamic welcome, they start with, all right, everyone, we're going to get started. Just so you know, the restrooms are over there. Make sure you've got your parking pass punched before you leave. We're going to be having lunch at noon. You know, they give you all this logistics as the very first thing when they get going with the gathering. And as Priya points out, there's no need for that. And it really sets you off on the wrong tone. You can always pause partway into the first part of your gathering and then tell people about those logistical details. Like, they don't need to know about the punch the card thing until later. So having a thoughtful, dynamic opening is really impactful. She also talks about, even before you get there, priming, uses that term priming for thinking about how you can start with that intention, start with your purpose for the gathering before your guests ever arrive. She says that when she works with her clients, she almost always has a pre-work, like a guest workbook that they're going to be filling out, and they turn it in before they come to the gathering. And if you are going to do pre-work, she recommends two things. One, giving them something that will connect them with and remember their own sense of purpose related to that gathering. And then secondly, to have them share honestly the nature of the challenge that they're dealing with. That can really prime the pump for what you're going to be doing during the gathering. So the basic steps that she walks through in the book are priming, then preparation, ushering people in, then launching your gathering, then fusing your guests into the gathering. Okay, 6, the penultimate, perhaps, chapter, if I got that word right. I don't think I did. Keep your best self out of my gathering. I think this was interesting. It was talking about how people want to show up and they have that performative way about them. I'm sure you've seen this before. I mean, I feel it a little bit as I'm performing for you all, giving you this book report. When you're in front of people and you're trying to make a good impression, you're often more edited. She talks in this chapter about how so many people host panel discussions at a conference, and the panels are so boring because no one's willing to say anything that might be real, might be potentially controversial. So they end up just kind of being about nothing. So she gives some suggestions of how to really poke underneath the surface, delve deeper with your guests, figure out how to get to that actual juice in there and find something interesting. Make sure that the gathering is actually something new and fresh, or something deeper, different, moves things forward in a way. I was thinking about how I did this maybe at my high school reunion that I just went to. I was asking people during these somewhat awkward networking moments as we're getting together and for our high school reunion. I started just asking people, what's your midlife crisis? Or usually I wouldn't ask that. I'd say, hey, come on over. We're just talking about midlife crises. Have you had yours yet? Here's what I'm doing for mine. He's going to be doing this for his. And it ended up being kind of a fun talking point. It allowed us to go a bit beyond the like, what do you do for work? Do you have kids? Where do you live? Got to some more interesting conversations. All right, that maybe relates to her 7th chapter, which is cause good controversy. Cause good controversy. And a tool that she talks about in this chapter is a heat map. I am fascinated by this, and I really want to look into doing it. She said that when she gets a new client, she knows what she's going to be working on. She will draw a heat map. Where's the heat in this gathering? Who's got conflict with who? What is a sacred cow that you're not supposed to talk about? What are going to be the moments which would really create heat and tension in the gathering? And then she's not going to avoid those. She's actually going to figure out, how do we move through those, or how do we intentionally and thoughtfully confront those rather than avoiding them. I heard something related to this on a podcast I listened to called Ear Hustle. I highly recommend Ear Hustle and Death, Sex, and Money. They talked about this from the standpoint of being an interviewer and how you start in your interviewing of a subject, and you can tell when you've asked a question that has created, found that heat moment, has found that moment that's got tension for the person. And it's like, that's where the story is. As an interviewer, you definitely don't want to avoid that. And at the same time, of course, you want to be thoughtful in how you pursue those questions and how you get into that. So the other thing she does talk about avoiding. So you're not going to avoid these heat moments. You're not going to avoid this controversy. But what you are going to avoid is a free-for-all of spewing grievances. And actually, recently, I had a couple of clients as a facilitator who came to me and said, we've had a lot happen in the last few years. People are upset, maybe morale is low. And they had suggested to me, maybe we just need to let everybody let it all out. Get everybody together in a room and let them just basically spew their grievances. And I was I was really reassured to see that Priya does not recommend that, because I did not think that was a good idea. But I got at what they were wondering and what she's talking about in this chapter, which is, okay, you don't want to just do a free for all. And at the same time, if you avoid those points of tension and conflict entirely, then you may be avoiding the entire work that you're there to pursue. She was talking about some interesting creative ways she's done this in the chapter. It reminded me of things like dance offs, Vogue, voguing and ballroom culture, rap battles. She actually brought in the story of the movie Fight Club and how these sort of middle-aged men needed an outlet. They needed a place so they could just let this aggression out. And I love the quote that I had totally forgotten from Fight Club of, I don't have to be a slave to the IKEA nesting instinct. So this is a thing that has been around forever, of societies needing to figure out, how do we have a safe, constructive way of letting off steam, and letting people's conflict with each other actually have a release valve. And sometimes that's the role of the gathering, or that needs to be part of the design of the gathering, is to allow for that. And she clarified that she doesn't feel like this is every gathering. That's not always the purpose. But if it is part of the purpose, that is something you have to do very thoughtfully and with artful design. All right, the final chapter is accept that there is an end. And particularly if you are the host of the gathering, it is up to you to end the gathering. This is true in both work and personal, but I can think of many situations from personal gatherings that I've been to, parties and such, where there was no real ending. Nobody gave you permission to leave. And it really does create awkwardness as a guest. You don't want to be the first to leave. You're just kind of waiting to figure out, when is it polite to exit. And as the host, that is part of your authority. Part of that lasting commitment is seeing it through to having an ending, having a way to let people know we're wrapping up now. She gave the example of last call at a bar. And the function that serves, giving people that preparation of knowing, oh, this is wrapping up. If I have something left to say, if I have something left to do, this is my warning call that this is coming to a close. So that is my summation of some key points from The Art of Gathering with Priya Parker. I definitely signed up for her newsletter. She also has a course. I am a huge fan. I'm a fangirl over here of Priya Parker, and can't wait to devour more of what she has to say. And I hope that I've done it a fair job of summarizing for you all. So again, I'm Sharon TewksburyBloom, and I'm a facilitator with Bloom Facilitation, and grateful to have this opportunity to share.